In a small garage in Longwall Street, Morris founded what would become Europe's biggest car manufacturer. In 1913, he built his first car here and called it, rather inspirationally, the Morris Oxford. Just as well, then, that he didn't set up business in Ashby-de-la-Zouch. The enterprise that grew out of it, called the Morris Garage, gave its initials to a later creation, the MG. By the mid-1920s, Morris had a huge factory at Cowley and was producing 50,000 cars a year, more than anywhere else in Europe. Eventually, his factories were turning out some 300,000 cars a year, and lots of other British companies like Austin, Riley, Sunbeam, Hillman, Alvis, Bentley, Armstrong Siddeley, Wolseley, Fraser-Nash, Triumph, and Rolls-Royce were prospering equally. Now, apart from a few marginal producers like Morgan and Reliant, there are no British-owned car companies at all. So it goes, I guess. If you have lost that piece of your national heritage, you have at least kept lots of others. Now here's something you do incomparably well: country villages. What makes a place like Chipping Campden so special and splendid is that it seems so effortless and composed and unshowy. It's actually a great jumble of architectural styles going back over 7 centuries, but there's not one thing about it that jars. There's a certain modesty in scale and tone about Britain that I, for one, find very attractive. Ask anyone in Britain what they aspire to, and 9 times out of 10 they'll reply, a place in the country. What we are all guaranteed to reach is that place in the next life. Yet here again there is a certain beguiling humility. Here we find the tomb of Herbert Henry Asquith, who, according to the inscription, was Prime Minister of England from 1908 to 1916. I think he was actually Prime Minister of rather more than just England. In America, he would almost certainly have a presidential library, and certainly something much grander and more elaborate than this. You have to admire the modesty of it. But for real simplicity and anonymity, you could hardly improve on here lies Eric Arthur Blair, born June 25th, 1903, died January 21st, 1950. Eric Arthur Blair was better known to the world as George Orwell. One other thing you do supremely well in Britain is dottiness. Indeed, there's a certain affection in the very word. It isn't that eccentricity is unique to Britain, it's just that it flourishes here at a higher level. Snows Hill Manor in Gloucestershire was home for nearly 4 decades to a man who dedicated his life to one single-minded pursuit. His name was Charles Paget Wade, and he was a bit of a collector. He collected so much that there were 2 things he couldn't fit in the house: his wife and himself. Wade never lived in the manor house, but across the way in this building. They call it the cottage, but it's actually not much more comfortable or commodious than an old barn. It's just as cluttered with stuff as the bigger house next door, but it incorporates some very interesting design features. He had an extremely domineering mother, and to discourage her from coming for long visits, he had this completely pointless set of steps put into the entrance to the bathroom. What a wondrous place this is. What other country, after all, could possibly have come up with place names like Great Snoring and Farley Wallop, or a game like cricket that goes on for 3 days and never seems to start? Who else would think it not the least odd to make their judges wear little mops on their heads, compel the Lord Chancellor to sit on something called the woolsack, or take pride in a naval hero whose dying wish was to be kissed by a fellow named Hardy? Please, Hardy, full on the lips, with just a bit of tongue. What other nation could have given us William Shakespeare, pork pies, Christopher Wren, Windsor Great Park, Gardner's Question Time, and the chocolate digestive biscuit? None, of course.
Small it may be, but it does take some baiting. In the summer of 1863, a unit of Confederate soldiers in Missouri shot a cannon across the state line into Iowa, where I come from. The shot didn't actually hit anything. The ball dribbled harmlessly to a halt in a farmer's field, and the soldiers went away. It was Iowa's only direct involvement in the U.S. Civil War, and indeed its closest brush with actual history. So you can imagine how impressed I am to find myself in a place where history is not only all around you, but even sometimes underneath you.
A reenactment of a battle of the English Civil War. To my amazement, about 1,000 bankers and teachers and secretaries and other normal people dress up and entirely voluntarily bash the hell out of each other in the name of history. Eventually, the Cavaliers prevailed, Castle Howard was captured, and we were allowed to return to the 20th century. At other times, history looms over you. I've always thought the 100-foot-high column the first Duke of Marlborough erected to himself a tad egocentric. Maybe I'm a bit simple, but it's always seemed to me that the scale of Blenheim Palace and the scale of Marlborough's achievement are curiously disproportionate. I can understand how in a moment of mad rejoicing, a grateful nation might have awarded him, say, a 2-week timeshare for life in the Canaries, and maybe a set of cutlery or a teas maid. But I can't for the life of me comprehend how a scattering of triumphs in obscure places like Oudenarde and Malplaquet could be deemed to have entitled the conniving old fart to one of the great houses of Europe and a dukedom.
It's not that I don't stand by every word I wrote, but I kind of hope the 11th Duke hasn't read the book.
'Cause he's agreed to meet me. The first Duke would have viewed me as a colonial ruffian. Present Duke sees me differently. I'm a vital part of his and his stately pile's future, a tourist.
Is it harder to be a Duke as we come to the end of the 20th century?
I don't think the situation's changed, except I suppose you could term me a commercial Duke, in as much as nowadays we are much more businesslike. Anybody who has a stately home like Blenheim obviously has to run it as a business.
Was there not never part of you that thought, I don't really want all this, I'd rather go off and be a tugboat captain or something?
No, I'm very happy to be, and very privileged to be looking after Blenheim.
Does it ever worry you that this might not be infinitely sustainable?
It is a worry that. But all we can do is to use what we've got to the best ability we can to attract people so that we can maintain these homes.
The Duke's other house is under even greater threat. I broached the subject nervously.
How do you feel about the notion of abolishing the House of Lords as a in terms of hereditary lordships?
Well, I think in the 20th century it's very difficult to argue against it. On the other hand, I believe that this hasn't been thought through yet.
Do you think the time will come when hereditary aristocracy will be abolished altogether?
Your guess is as good as mine, but I don't think so.
Personally, I'm not sure that I wouldn't miss the aristocracy. The whole point of the aristocracy is that it is pointless. That is its one justification. And it's all built on a terribly fragile foundation. Start taking pieces of it away, and you may find the whole thing tumbling down. Once you accept that there is no purpose in having hereditary peers any longer, then you're bound to notice that there isn't much practical purpose in most of what makes up the traditional side of Britain. Take Trooping the Colour, the annual celebration of the Queen's official birthday, when members of the Guards Division and Household Cavalry put on their finest regalia and march about. I'm no military man, but I would guess that putting soldiers on horses and giving them swords is not the most likely route to battlefield triumph in the closing years of the 20th century. But of course, this is not about military might. It's about being pointless in a truly splendid sort of way. When the Russians or Chinese feel in a military mood, they parade tanks and missiles through a big open square. Americans have a noisy 21-gun salute or an elaborate fly-past. The French blow up a couple of islands in the South Pacific. But the British put on shiny helmets and bearskin hats, get out their swords and horses, and pretend with all their hearts it's still 1860. I think that's just wonderful. Incidentally, as long as you create no more hereditary peerages, they will gradually disappear anyway. Because not everyone produces heirs, on average about 4 or 5 noble titles die out each year. At that rate, it has been calculated, the hereditary nobility will vanish altogether by 2175. I certainly hope so. In any case, long before then, they will have been displaced by another, more modern kind of aristocracy, that of wealth. Jane Proctor, editor of The Tatler, believes that the British class system has fractured into a multiplicity of tiers.
But then there's maybe 10 different sorts of man and woman, or hundreds, as many different sorts as there are people, because it's a huge melting pot here now. There's no such thing as the typical Englishman with his bowler hat and furled umbrella. If you went to the city trying to find one, you'd search for days. And if you did, it would be someone who was on a kind of retro trip. There's a whole feeling now that London's been stolen from the British. People can no longer afford to live where they were brought up, say in Cadogan Square or Egerton Terrace, and they're now living in the inner suburbs. So places like Battersea, Clapham, Fulham, Chiswick, Islington are full of the so-called upper middle classes. I mean, you now have a situation where you have a house in the inner suburbs, say in Clapham, that's worth £1 million. But maybe the person who lives in that house was actually brought up in a house that's now worth 10 million and owned by an American banker.
So someone who was born in Knightsbridge by rights ought to be able to live there?
Normally, I mean, one would expect if you're, I mean, I'm not talking about people who aren't doing well. If they're doing well in their careers, you'd expect them to be able to keep up with the standards that their parents had. But nowadays, sadly, because there's extreme wealth, there are very happily off people. You know, they're perfectly capable, they send their children to private schools, they have holidays, nice cars, etc. But they don't have extreme wealth. The extreme wealth, the people, the bonus babies with the £10 million bonuses from Salomons or Goldman Sachs, it's a huge difference between the guy who's come from the off earning $250,000 a year. Now that's poor.
$250,000 a year is poor.
If $250,000 is poor, then these people must be seriously impoverished. In fact, I think they are anything but. Macmillan may have been a little premature when he said it, but it's true now. You've never had it so good. There is a sophistication and cosmopolitanism today that cuts right across class boundaries. For all the things that still separate them, the British have actually never been more alike.
It's terribly cozy, isn't it?
It used to be that the various classes lived entirely different kinds of lives, bought different objects, ate different foods. Today, nearly all people enjoy much the same sorts of things. All that separates them is degree. Just around the corner from the throngs of Oxford Street is a much quieter and much costlier street. Even during sale time, I didn't dare look in the windows. I'm here to meet Beverly Bloom, somebody who would spend more on a coat than I would on surgery.
How about this little pink suit?
That's very fetching.
Nice colour.
Very nice. So it's how much is that?
It's 1,500.
Beverly is charming, sweet-natured, and a pleasure to be around. And thank goodness I don't have to keep her.
Really glamorous. What do you think of that?
It's certainly very striking. How much is that?
This is £2,000.
£2,000.
But then this must be real. It's real fur, and it's by Dolce & Gabbana, so it's kind of to be expected.
So what price do you start to bat an eyelid when you are looking at clothes?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't spend £2,000 without thinking very hard about it. But it just depends on the
Like
outfit and if I think I need it that desperately. But I mean, I have to say, clothes, it's really my only indulgence. It's my only really expensive hobby. So
How expensive are we talking?
I really couldn't say. It just depends on really what's around. I mean, I might spend thousands one season and then nothing at all the next. It just depends what's around.
I did see a newspaper cutting in which your father was quoted as saying that he'd have been happy if your spending was only £50,000 a year.
He did say that, but I wouldn't believe everything you read. I mean, you probably said that as a joke. I don't think I'm that bad.
To say that Britain has become a consumer paradise in recent years is to put the matter mildly. We tend to think of America as the land of the hard sell, but believe me, it's nothing compared with what Britain has become. Here you are constantly assaulted with commercial blandishments, on cabs, on buses, on the sides of buildings. Even the most venerable events and institutions share their names with the commercial world. The Carling Premiership, the Coca-Cola Cup, the NatWest Trophy. The day can't be far off when we get things like the Kellogg's Pop-Tart Queen Mother, the Mitsubishi Corporation proudly presents Regent's Park, and the Pepsi-Cola Plaza, formerly Trafalgar Square.
That should be safe enough.
Beverly invited me out for an evening, sponsored by a model agency and a toothpaste company. She asked me to make my own way.
Sorry?
I told him I was the Des Moines correspondent for Vogue. It always works. Beverly arrived looking like $1 million, and costing not much less, I dare say. I'm here for two reasons: to watch the Young Model of the Year competition, and to help raise the average weight in the room to over 6 3/4 stone. I don't believe I've ever been among quite so many svelte and willowy people, nor experienced quite so much chatter accompanied by quite so little cerebral activity.
It was supposed to be 8:30, but of course everything runs really late. I mean, I was just in Paris at the couture shows. We were made to wait for over an hour for the Dior show. In the hottest day of the year, it was quite unbearable.
I do hate it when they make you wait for a Dior show.
See, I know nothing about this, so you have to explain everything. I shop at Marks and Spencer. Would it be terrible if you were in here and you saw someone else in this dress?
It wouldn't be the end of the world, but it's not particularly nice to turn up to an event that's the same as somebody else.
Out on the catwalk, the music was even more insistent and throbbing, and the models even more impossibly young and willowy. Several of the finalists were just 14 years old. I have bills that are older than that. It may have been the moment of their young lives, but I really felt quite out of it. I left early since I was due to take a train to somewhere up north the next morning, where I knew I'd feel even more out of it. Two questions. One, what's the most visited part of this island? Answer, the Lake District. question 2. What's the most visited part of the most visited part? Windermere? Keswick? Wordsworth's Dove Cottage? Peter Rabbit's home? No, this is Sellafield Nuclear Power Plant. I can't help notice that some of these pipes seem to be leaking. I have to say I had expected Sellafield to be a little more, reassuring. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is that not a bin bag around that broken traffic light? If they cover a broken traffic light with a bin bag, then how, I wonder, do they deal with a shattered fuel rod? With a dustpan and brush? I'd expected it to be a little more leading edge. This looks like a nuclear power station designed by Railtrack or Lewisham Borough Council. Overspill is not perhaps the most confidence-building term in a nuclear power station. Inside the visitor center, things are rather slicker. It's a sort of science museum from the people who brought you the X-Files, with a dash of music hall thrown in. It's full of hands-on displays designed to make you feel that the mighty atom is your pal, and that nuclear energy is safe, clean, and fun. Delete any 3 if you're a skeptic. The target audience is for the younger siblings of those 14-year-old models from the catwalk, the inquiring minds who pester parents to take them to the Epcot Center or Disney World, except that here they're closer to plutonium than Pluto. People come from all over Britain to visit the center. Nuclear waste comes from all over the world. Sellafield doesn't actually produce much energy these days. It's more a recycling center, something they do rather well. If any city in Britain has been recycled, it's Glasgow. Or maybe liberated is the more accurate term. I remember when I first came to the city in 1973, being profoundly stunned at how suffocatingly dark and soot-blackened it was. I'd never seen a place so choked and grubby. But in the 1980s, Glasgow began a vast renovation, and today its extensive stock of old buildings and statues gleams anew. The city centre is full of handsome structures that elsewhere would have been swept away, including even some old police boxes.